Yeah. Okay, probably going to finish off just mind scribble. So let's go male, female. Equals reproduction, yes? Male, female. And then this process stops. And then we have surviving female and clone under the right conditions. Female clone, female clone. Now, if we continue this way, well, that would be the end of the bloodline, let's say. But it still holds on. Now, rather than trending this way, it's now trending downwards. Female clone. So male, female, which got it up to the point. Reproduce. Something stopped here. How that would know that, you could say, is fluke. And then it begins to clone. Now let's assuming that it doesn't find a male. Nothing evolves, it's just a female clone. Now would it begin to go backwards? Now that's an interesting question in itself, but backwards in the sense that would it make a few variables of Hermiclone? Would we see an odd variation? As well as this female clone growth. If it went on to evolve and pass information after an amount of time, how much time? Well, assuming that you could scoop this life force up, be in nature, stick it into an incubator, and give it all of it what it needs in order to maintain this existence, its trend, outcome. Assuming that it will continue cloning, if it then branches out and makes a Hermy, it would be a reverse mum-dad in one. Now, would this begin to engineer these Hermy clones now and then? Would it begin to make female and male individually that was mum, dad? Which adds some variations. Now, it was very interesting when I was doing this graph. And would these continue off to be in clone? But version 2, version 3, version 2, yes. Anyway, oops, there goes the polish. So, what would these next clones look like? If it was to continue on the trend and it started splitting backwards, it would make the reverse of what it was, would be a mum-dad. It sounds weird if we were to think about it that way. And then does it begin to separate? It depends how you draw the graph, to what pattern. If it made a few variations, it would continue cloning on its trajectory, which is this line and this one. Essentially the same plant. But each time it does so, it passes on a little bit more different information, and eventually, would it resemble in a clone? If it looked backwards long enough, would it begin to create a hermaphrodite? which essentially would be a reverse mom and dad. It's interesting, a kid creating a kid in order to extract. Now, would this Hermie go on to create a male and a female given enough time? Seems really interesting, doesn't it? Not really. And all of that from a female clone. Hermie variable. Now, if I keep going back with this ratio, Hermie clone now and then, which would then self-clone into a female male. Going backwards until we have enough variables, can you then start going, I don't know if that would even work. What happens if you cross Hermie male with Hermie? Does this then start to go off in a different direction? Because the variation went one way to achieve this, and now it's going backwards to achieve this in a very different way. If this created a Hermie, that's another line. Yeah, and female, another line. Could you then begin to cross? I don't know. Anyway, just playing around with that. If I was looking at cloning going backwards or going forwards, and you were to leave this process as it has done nature to continue on, how would that change? Would it continue making clones for as long as how long? Does it ever turn off, that process? With the right conditions, would it live forever? Again, and which direction is it going? Essentially, I don't know, female Hermie, male, female, male, female, which is another Hermie, into identifying male, female. Are these Hermies then, in reverse, this way, a new variable? And with each one, the new variable of Hermie, is that enough to begin the process off again, with each Hermie creating a new strain? Wow, that's fascinating. Going backwards for as much as your DNA. Would it pick it backwards? That's the question, because it knows that it was created by this, and this is what made it. In order for it to reverse that, would it create a hermaphrodite version of both of these? Then itself, over its variations, creates the odd male and female from that. While passing down information. Interesting. That's all if the information part is being passed, or we call it evolve. Evolving, yes. Reliving. Therefore, life is taught to evolve, even in the clone ratio. But it's then making those clones run this way, which gives you a different variation. Okay, what if I mix this with this? Does it work? Well, no, maybe. If it does, and it gets successful, this one is going to be different from this one by changing this. Interesting how life comes and goes. If not, what else is it doing it for? If not to survive, to evolve. Reverse birth, that's interesting. But it creates a very different variation each time. Anyway, just thinking about this one out of the box, but yeah. So if it starts to make clones, does it ever stop? And how does it know when to stop? And is that going backwards? Or would it continue on with this new so-called unlocked superpower of cloning? And then eventually do the males learn to clone? And if so, you then have an equal ratio of growth of cloning tapped into you, and you also have the reproduction as well. Reproduction and cloning. Which I think increases the armor of being able to exist or survive. Depends what you believe, but yeah, I don't know. If I was going with this sort of direction or trend with a life force, I would look at it a little bit more this way. If anything goes into this protocol, it has the potential, so it starts cloning. That's triggered. Cloning is... If it then can pick apart of what it was by making a hermaphrodite, which would be like a mum, dad, all in the same vessel, then would eventually, given enough time, would that learn how to identify the female version of it and the male? It seems unlikely, but even still, fantasy. Assuming nature continues on for a long time. If you give it more time as a life force, it's trying to dominate anyway. That's one thing that we can look at life forms are trying to do. And in order to do that, they have to learn. So where would they go given more time? And it all points to survival, longevity. Yeah, I think it would start reverse ordering it. Because once you begin to reverse order this enough and pick each one, teach each one to take a layer back. So let's imagine that our bloodline, each one is mom and dad for each line. If it could create a Hermy version, could the Hermy temper to create a version, because this information will be taught to learn a female and male version of its component backwards, which then means you're going backwards essentially. And each one is the split into mum and dad, maybe we could do it this way. Essentially resurrecting the line each time backwards. Until eventually all is established and it creates a new line. And then, given enough time on top of that, what would you do next with all of this extra energy? Assuming nature could continue on, it's going to be on a particular type of path like this. I'm pretty sure of it. It wants to exist. It's now learnt cloning. It now has mum, dad. Those possibilities are endless, especially if it could figure out the male. And then life begins to take off again, because the possibilities of mum and dad, how many more seeds this time? Therefore, there's more X amount of children. Wow, that really changes it. And you have the ability to clone. Wow. And reproduce with your once former partner. Now that's fascinating. Whoa. Anyway, so therefore it's dominating, but it's not really. And then if you were to give it more time, where would it go with that process? Would it see to trying to recreate another? Well, anyway, by that time, it depends on what has learnt it. But that would be an interesting thing to be able to do. Not only be able to clone yourself, that's somewhat of eternal existence. Again, it's heavily reliant on anything else to make an environment as perfect as that. But it does show you that eternal life could exist, which is interesting, although it seems unlikely. But assuming that we could wrap these clones up, where would they head? And could it just fizzle out? The last attempts at staying in the environment for a bit longer, and slowly but surely that begins to drop down. But assuming that we could make it under the environment that thrived, which will have an optimal ratio, I'm just going to put off, then that should live inside that margin of when it was most happy and grow in abundance. And then this one might work at this optimal. But with this process of cloning from one to the other, passing down information, should mean that you get ahead of that curve, because you can adapt to the environment and forever changing. So, shades of grey. But even still, cloning and reproduction. Fascinating. And if anything else were to do this, or if you then put that into an explosion or something on the Earth where a meteorite, unlikely, but let's just assume it did in this hypothetical environment, smashes it apart. That's a lot of seeds going off in multiple directions, especially if it's cloning and it's able to slow down and go into bulb growth. Does it start looking at its bulb? Interesting. Whether it lands on a better world or worse, can it adapt quick enough? Well, now if it's cloning, I think that's prepping. Having the ability to clone from one to another means that you are capable of changing very quickly and learning the environment fast. That will ensure your survival, which is adapting. Rapid adaptation to the stress of the new environment until you reach a balance. Yeah. So that fast learning. In this way, cloning helps in this process. Each clone pushes out slightly more adapted to the environment by telling the information into the next clone, by slightly altering it, which would then be engineered. That's guaranteed survival. But again, assuming that it could do that and it continued on an extra billion years, what would it have done? Would it have got better? Would it have weakened out? Would it have begun splitting back? Turning into hermaphrodites, then from that to variations of female, maybe male. And a reversal again, Hermy, and then male, female, which would be mum and dad. My word. And again from this one and this. Yeah, it's interesting. Anyway, very fascinating. But what would you do with more time? Would you do something like that? Would you examine that? Get to the end of a bloodline, perhaps? Start resurrecting backwards, which I think it would probably be more achievable than trying to predict anything going forwards. And then retaining information. Yeah, that would be interesting. I can put a theory to the test. Deja vu, anyone? Did you get this? Yeah, which I think is more like the process of the universe, this breathing ratio. And it's almost like atomics splitting as opposed to coming together to creating, combining, which again, interesting pattern. It goes one way and then echoes back another. Whether it begins to break itself apart in this ratio, because then there's more versions of mum, dad, seeding this way, and now there's an alternate way, changing the clones, engineering the clones further. And then a little bit longer, if you were to give it longer and assuming that it was on this little trajectory, which why not, it's learning. If it began to use from the strains or strands that it has, a way of making a subspecies compatible for adding into more variations of life. Would it begin to engineer the clones so much so that they take on a completely different resemblance? Are they compatible or not? Again, with enough time. Oh man, that would be an interesting process. Given enough time. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But there again. This stuff, yes. This remains to be seen, I think. If you could follow it long enough. Imagine if humans could do that. And assuming that this could work in any life form. That's a hell of an unlocking. Yeah, I wouldn't mind that.